Scope creep is a thing that seems to happen a lot in development and in design. It's essentially what happens when the scope of a project that you originally agreed to falls outside of that agreement. And this can happen for a number of reasons, but usually I find the main reason that this happens is simply because the understanding of what a bit of work is doesn't always line up between yourself and the person you're making it with. If you don't know who I am, I'm Adrian from Australia. I do videos around design and development, so if you haven't already, hit like and subscribe and we'll just jump straight back into it. The understanding for building a website is very broad. It can encapsulate everything. And when this is not clearly defined, especially in a proposal or when we're talking about a bit of work, then it means that the expectations that both people might have might be very different. For example, if I'm building out a website for a client and they're a small business, they might just be able to afford something really simple like a small $500 website. My expectation for that is just some cheap template that I'm going to build up on WordPress. It's just going to have a few pages and maybe a contact us form or something like that. But if I just agree to build a website for them for $500, their expectation might be something different. They might be thinking that they'll be getting a full e-commerce platform. And even though the conversation for that never came up in the original discussions, it also never came up in general. So it wasn't included or excluded from the proposal. It essentially is up in the air. And when they come back and say, hey, how do I sell products on my website? Where's the e-commerce part? You might say that this isn't part of the project. And the response that I normally hear from clients when scope creep happens is that they thought it was. They thought that when we said that we would deliver them a website that, can essentially represent their business, they thought that that would include e-commerce. Maybe they thought that will include an API that'll essentially automatically generate invoices for their system straight to Xero and automatically email the client and be automated in all parts of the process. The expectation can be anything and it can grow out exponentially depending on what the understanding is for a website. And this is why scope creep is such a tricky thing. I found that scope creep has happened to me a number of times throughout the years when I've been doing web development and when I've been doing design. It can happen in design in a number of ways, such as you might be expecting to do a design for a person, and their expectation of what that design looks like might be a little bit different. So when you present it, they might want something different for you to do. So you'll go back to the drawing board and redo it again. And then maybe they'll change their mind again and you'll have to go back to the drawing board a second and a third and a fourth time. At some point, you're falling outside of the parameters of the job anymore because you've worked more hours than you originally quoted for. And this is sort of how scope creep also happens in design. And there's a number of ways we can tackle scope creep. From my experience, the number one way to tackle scope creep is to be really clear about your expectations when you're building something out. This means that you need to define the scope of your project. You need to make sure that there are clear objectives that you're trying to complete. And you also have to define what's outside of the scope. So that way you have an idea of what's not included in the project. By having these two, then you're giving the client or the person that's requesting the project a much clearer definition of what you're actually building. So for example, if I'm building out this small template, inside the scope, I'll say that I'm building out only 4 or 5 pages with a contact form. I'll also add a out of scope section, which means that anything beyond 5 pages is not included. Anything with e-commerce is not included. Payment gateways and custom APIs aren't included. We can take a look at that outside of the project once the project's completed, but this is definitely outside of the scope of the original project. We can always include these things in the original agreement if they're things that they want, but they have to understand that there is a price and a real-world time required to invest and build these features out. And that way their expectations are more or less on the same point as you. And this is essentially how you can start slowing down or stopping scope creep. It's by defining the expectations and training the other people to understand what you're delivering to them. In terms of scope creep, I've had a number of issues trying to deal with it. It's an ongoing thing, but I think with a good defined proposal, with good defined scopes and out of scope objectives, we can cut down on those issues. Anyway, these are what I do. These are the things that I do to fight and combat scope creep. What do you guys do? What experience have you had with scope creep? I'd love to know. Anyway, these are my thoughts on scope creep. I hope you enjoyed them. If you did, hit like, hit subscribe. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.